It was the kind of evening you don't forget. Not because of what I planned, but because of what I saw. I decided to surprise Emma, my wife, at the university after her evening class. I parked just outside her building, a bouquet of flowers resting on the passenger seat. The plan was simple. Surprise her, take her out for dessert, and remind her how much I supported her dreams. The sun was setting, painting the building in warm orange light. I leaned back in my seat, watching as the last students trickled out. That's when I noticed the office lights still on, a yellow square glowing from the second floor. I wouldn't have thought much of it if I hadn't seen the shadows. Two figures close together. Too close. At first, I didn't think much of it. I chuckled to myself, thinking it looked ridiculous. What were they doing up there? I pulled out my phone, more out of amusement than anything else, and hit record. I thought it would make for a funny story later. Maybe I'd joke about it with Emma or someone at work. Caught some late-night romance in your building. As I focused on the window, one shadow leaned into the other. Their movements were rhythmic. I smirked, still not really processing what I was seeing. It wasn't academic, that much was clear. I decided I'd recorded enough. Time to call Emma and spring my surprise. Feeling playful, I put my phone down and dialed Emma. My heart picked up, not out of suspicion but from excitement. I pictured her stepping outside, surprised and delighted to see me. I imagined the flowers in my hand, her smile lighting up the evening. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I frowned, but brushed it off. She was probably wrapping up her conversation. I tried again. Still nothing. Then came the text. Still with my professor, going over grades. Be out soon. I glanced back up at the window. The shadows had stilled. One figure moved, reaching for something, probably a phone. My chest tightened, though I wasn't sure why. The timing. I called her again, this time with a creeping unease I couldn't shake. No answer. My mind began to race, each thought crashing into the next like waves during a storm. Something wasn't right. The shadows in the window shifted. The one holding the phone turned back to the other, and their movements resumed. This time they were slower, almost deliberate. It was then, like a lock snapping into place, that the realization hit me. I sat frozen in my car, the bouquet of flowers wilting in my grip. When I returned home, the silence hit me harder than I expected. The door clicked shut behind me, but the emptiness felt louder than a shout. I stood in the entryway, gripping the back of a chair, and let the weight of what I'd seen crash down on me. Emma and I had built this life brick by brick. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was ours. I thought about the small apartment we started in after we got married. We had nothing then, just dreams and hand-me-down furniture. The only thing holding us together through those early years was sheer determination. I sank into the couch, the same couch where we used to sit together, talking about our future late into the night. I remembered how beautiful she looked on our wedding day, her smile bright enough to outshine the sun. I remembered how we'd clung to each other when the doctor first told us we might struggle to have kids. Every obstacle we faced, we'd overcome, together. Or at least I thought we had. Now, it felt like all those memories were covered in dust, tainted by what I'd seen tonight. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd taken everything we'd fought for and crushed it underfoot. The sound of tires on gravel startled me. A moment later, the doorbell rang. I didn't want to answer it. I knew who it would be. When I opened the door, Emma stood there, her face streaked with tears. Her hair was messy, and her coat hung loosely off one shoulder. For a moment, she looked so much like the girl I fell in love with that my anger faltered. "Please, Daniel," she whispered. Her voice cracked as she begged me to let her in. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. She collapsed onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. Between sobs, she said she was sorry, that what I'd seen wasn't what it looked like. She claimed she'd been manipulated, that the professor had cornered her, pressured her. "I didn't want to," she insisted. "I didn't even know what was happening. It's like I wasn't myself." Her words sounded desperate, rehearsed even. I sat across from her, saying nothing. I couldn't tell where the truth ended and the lies began. Her sobs slowed, and she reached for my hand. "Please, Daniel. I love you. He's just so powerful. If you do anything to him, he'll ruin you. He can ruin both of us. Please, promise me you won't touch him." Her words broke through my fog of anger. Emma wasn't powerful. She was fragile, even if she'd hurt me. Part of me wanted to protect her, to believe she'd been a victim. But another part of me couldn't forget the shadows in that window. "I need to think," I finally said, my voice cold. "I can't do this right now." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I grabbed my keys, told her to get in the car, and drove her to her parents' house. She cried the entire ride, and I stayed silent, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. By the time I returned home from dropping Emma at her parents' house, the sadness had begun to harden into something sharper. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was furious. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. The professor's face was burned into my memory. His smug panic as he tried to scramble out of the situation. He had destroyed my life, ripped apart everything I'd worked for. And now Emma had the audacity to beg for his protection? The thought was laughable. I powered up my laptop, my hands shaking. Not with doubt, but with purpose. I wasn't just going to hurt him. I was going to ruin him. I started with academic review sites. His name carried weight in his field, but that was a double-edged sword. The more prominent someone is, the harder they fall when rumors start spreading. Using anonymous accounts, I wrote scathing reviews, all carefully worded to sound genuine. I painted a picture of a man who preyed on vulnerable students, hinting at inappropriate relationships, manipulative behavior, and abuse of power. I added just enough detail to make it believable. He cornered me in his office. One review read, "I was too scared to speak out at the time, but people need to know." Next, I turned to forums. Academic communities thrive on gossip, and it didn't take long for the threads to pick up steam. I could almost hear the whispers starting. Could it be true? Did anyone else notice? By dawn, I'd spread the seeds of his downfall across every platform I could think of. Social media, student forums, conference review sites. No corner of his world was untouched. Within days, my plan began to bear fruit. Emma's university announced an internal investigation into the professor's conduct. I heard whispers from mutual acquaintances that his colleagues were distancing themselves, and students were avoiding his classes. Still, it wasn't enough. I filed an anonymous complaint directly with the university's administration, attaching carefully worded accounts of his behavior and demanding they take action. Every word felt like a release, a way to channel the storm inside me into something tangible. By the end of the week, the professor was under scrutiny. His reputation, a carefully built fortress of accolades and respect, had started to crumble. It wasn't justice, not entirely, but it was a start. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. The silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional hum of the fridge or the creak of the floorboards under my restless pacing. I didn't go to work that week. I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to Emma, to the child we'd dreamed of, to the life we'd built and how quickly it had crumbled. I found myself standing in the doorway of what was supposed to be the nursery. The room was half finished, with pale yellow walls we'd painted together on a rare weekend off. I remembered Emma laughing as she accidentally streaked paint across my shirt, and how I'd chased her with a roller in mock revenge. It had felt like hope. Now it felt like a cruel joke. Every memory of Emma was like that. Beautiful at first, but tainted when I thought about what she'd done. I'd worshipped her, put her on a pedestal so high that even now, after everything, part of me wanted to believe her. She said she was manipulated, that the professor had forced her into something she didn't want. Could I believe her? The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know where her lies ended and where the person I loved began. That's what made it so hard. I loved her. God help me, I still loved her. The next time she called, I almost didn't answer. but something in me couldn't resist. Her voice on the other end of the line was soft, broken. She begged me to come talk, to let her explain. I told her I couldn't. Not yet. She cried, saying she'd do anything to make it right. I sat in silence after the call ended, staring at the yellow walls of the nursery. It was then that I realized something. I might still love Emma, but love wasn't enough. Not anymore. I needed to protect myself, to figure out what I wanted, not what she wanted me to believe. The next morning, I started packing up her things. I left them in neat boxes by the front door, ready for her to pick up. I didn't tell her she was out of my life for good. I wasn't even sure myself, but I needed space to think. And while I thought, I turned my focus back to the one thing I knew for sure. The professor. If Emma wanted my forgiveness, she might eventually get it. But the man who had stepped into my life and destroyed it? He was never getting off that easy. 2 weeks passed after Emma moved out, and for the first time in years, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to fill the silence by throwing myself into work, but no amount of busted transmissions or oil changes could drown out the memories. She called me almost every night. At first, I didn't answer, but when I finally did, she sounded smaller than I'd ever heard her. She begged to come back, not just for her sake, but for ours. She kept saying she wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. I was lost, Daniel, she said. I didn't know how to stop what was happening, but I love you. I never stopped loving you. There was so much pain in her voice that it chipped away at the anger I'd been holding on to. And then she said something that broke me completely. We waited so long to have children, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know we can't let this be the end of us. I need you, and so will our child. I hadn't expected her to bring up our dream like that. For years, we talked about building a family, about what our life could look like with a little one running through the house. We'd prayed for it, fought for it, and when it didn't happen, it had crushed both of us. Her words reopened that wound. The next day, I took the boxes of her belongings out of the entryway and told her she could come back. The first few weeks of her return were cautious, tense. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. Emma tried to show me she'd changed. She cooked dinner, left little notes for me like she used to, even started talking about the baby. But something felt off. It wasn't just her. It was me. I couldn't look at her without remembering the shadows in that office. The way the professor's hand brushed her arm as he scrambled away. The hurt was still there, buried under my attempts to move forward. Sometimes, I caught her looking at me the same way, as though she was wondering whether I'd ever forgive her. One evening, as we sat in the living room pretending everything was normal, I thought about my mother. I'd been 7 when my father walked out, leaving us with nothing but a note and a pile of unpaid bills. My mother had worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, and even then, I'd sometimes find her crying at the kitchen table after I'd gone to bed. I'd never understood how she'd managed to forgive him. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe she'd just moved on because there wasn't another option. Now, sitting there in the silence, I wondered if I was capable of the same. Emma's pregnancy became the center of our conversations. We talked about names, about whether the nursery would have blue or yellow walls. She seemed hopeful, almost happy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her timeline was vague when I pressed her about it, and she always deflected when I asked about the night in the office. Let's not talk about that, she said one evening, placing her hand over mine. Let's just focus on us and the baby. Okay? I nodded, but my doubts lingered. The day Emma gave birth was supposed to be the happiest of our lives. For months, I had clung to the hope that the child would be a fresh start, a way to mend the pieces of our broken life. I convinced myself that things could get better, that the woman I loved hadn't completely disappeared behind her mistakes. When the nurse placed the baby boy in Emma's arms, I felt a flicker of joy, but it lasted only a moment. The boy's features were delicate but unmistakable. The high cheekbones, the sharp nose, the dark, piercing eyes. It was like looking at the professor himself. My chest tightened, and the room spun. I told myself it couldn't be. Babies look like all kinds of people at birth, don't they? Maybe it was just my imagination. But the more I stared, the harder it was to lie to myself. I didn't say anything to Emma that day. She had just been through labor, and I didn't want to burden her with my doubts. Not yet. I stayed by her side, helping her in every way I could while she recovered. I brought her food, rocked the baby when she needed to rest, and tried to smile when she caught my eye. The days blurred together in the quiet rhythm of hospital life, but the question gnawed at me, day and night. When we finally brought the baby home, I knew it was time. A few nights later, after dinner, I carefully broached the subject. Emma, I began, my voice steady but hesitant. I need to talk to you about something. She looked up from where she sat holding the baby, her expression soft but wary. I told her everything. How I'd felt when I saw the baby, the doubts that had been eating at me since that moment. She didn't interrupt, but I could see the tears forming in her eyes. When I finished, she clutched the baby closer and began to cry. I hoped, she stammered, her voice shaking. I hoped he was ours, Daniel. I told myself it had to be true, that it would all work out somehow. But now, she hesitated, her tears falling freely. Now I don't know anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. She had known, deep down, that this might not be my child, but she hadn't wanted to admit it. And a small part of me understood. We agreed to take a paternity test. The days leading up to the test were unexpectedly tender. Emma and I slipped into a rhythm, caring for the baby together. Despite everything, our relationship felt warmer, softer, emotionally intimate in a way it hadn't been for months. There was no physical intimacy, no grand declarations of love. But there was a quiet connection, born from years of shared history and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild. I found myself growing attached to the baby. He was so small, so perfect, and every time I held him, I felt a pang of guilt. What if the test confirmed my suspicions? What if this wasn't my son? Could I walk away from him after holding him in my arms? After watching him sleep? And then there was Emma. Seeing her as a mother brought back the woman I'd fallen in love with. The warmth in her voice, the quiet strength in her movements. I would watch her with the baby and feel my chest tighten, tears threatening to fall. I had waited so long to see her like this. Now I wasn't sure if I could leave her. The morning of the paternity test, I woke before dawn. Emma was still asleep, curled up on the far side of the bed, the baby nestled in his bassinet. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rustle from the baby. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my coffee. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the mug. I told myself it was just the caffeine, but I knew better. The drive to the clinic was tense, neither of us speaking much. Emma held the baby close in the back seat, her expression unreadable. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but every word that came to mind felt too heavy. At the clinic, the process was quick. The technician swabbed my cheek, then Emma's, and finally the baby's. The nurse gave us a polite smile as she handed over the paperwork for the results. "You'll have them in about a week," she said. A week. 7 days that felt like an eternity stretched ahead of us. During that week, I clung to routine like it was the only thing keeping me afloat. Work became my refuge again. Fixing engines, aligning tires, those things made sense. They didn't have layers of doubt or complicated emotions attached to them. At home, Emma was trying harder than ever. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and doted on the baby, always with a quiet determination. It was as though she thought these small acts of love might make me forget why we were waiting. But I couldn't forget. Some nights, I found myself standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching the baby sleep. He was so peaceful, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. I felt a lump in my throat as I thought about what the results might say. I wanted him to be mine, desperately. When the envelope came, I froze. It was early evening, and Emma was feeding the baby in the living room. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, the weight of everything it represented pressing down on me. Emma noticed me standing in the doorway with the envelope in my hand. She stopped mid-motion, her eyes wide. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Do you want to open it?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "You do it." My hands felt clumsy as I tore the envelope open. The words on the page blurred for a moment before snapping into focus. Probability of paternity, 0%. I felt the world tilt. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, rereading the words as if they might change. But they didn't. He wasn't mine. I sank onto the couch, the paper trembling in my hands. Emma put the baby down in his bassinet and knelt in front of me, her hands clutching my knees. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know for sure. I really hoped he was yours. But..." Her voice cracked, and she dissolved into tears. I looked down at her, feeling a strange mix of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. "Emma," I said, my voice hoarse. I told you this would happen. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" She sobbed harder, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I could just make it work, if we could just be a family." I shook my head, pulling away from her touch. "We're not a family, Emma. Not anymore." Her sobs filled the room as I stood and walked toward the nursery. I looked down at the baby, sleeping so peacefully, completely unaware of the storm around him. He wasn't mine, but for a moment I wished he was. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, the crumpled test results on the table in front of me. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional soft cry of the baby from the nursery. My chest felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of me. I stared at the paper, reading the words over and over again. Probability of paternity, 0%. He wasn't mine. But somehow it didn't make things easier. My mind went back to the past few weeks. How I'd cradled the baby. How I'd watched Emma move through the house with a new kind of gentleness. For a brief moment, I'd thought we were rebuilding something. That maybe we could salvage what we had lost. But this wasn't something I could ignore. Emma found me hours later, still sitting at the table. She stood in the doorway, clutching the edge of the wall for support, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. "Daniel," she said softly, stepping closer. "I know you're angry. I know you hate me. But I love you. I love you more than anything. And the baby, he needs you. I need you." I looked up at her, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You lied to me, Emma. You didn't just cheat. You didn't just betray me. You lied to me for months. While you were pregnant, after he was born, because you thought I'd never figure it out." She dropped her gaze, her shoulders shaking. "I thought I was protecting us. I thought you might forgive me if we could just move forward." "Move forward," I repeated bitterly. "How can I move forward when every time I look at him, I see the professor? How can I forget what you did?" Emma fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm sorry for everything. I'll do anything to fix this. Please, Daniel, don't give up on us." Her words hit me hard, but I didn't know if I had it in me to forgive her. My heart wanted to believe her, to believe that this could somehow work, but my mind knew better. "I need time," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperation. "Time," I nodded. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I can't decide right now." The next day, I packed a bag and told Emma I needed space. I wasn't leaving for good, not yet, but I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I found a small motel on the outskirts of town and checked in under my first name only. The room was cramped and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, but it was quiet, and that was all I needed. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry. I cried for the boy I thought was mine, for the woman I thought I knew, for the years we had built together and the family I thought we were creating. Sitting in that tiny motel room, the walls closing in around me, I needed something to pull me out of my thoughts. My chest still felt tight from the tears I had let fall, but I was too exhausted to cry anymore. Without thinking, I reached for the remote and turned on the TV. A movie was already playing. At first, I barely paid attention. Some couple arguing, a foster care agency in the background, just noise to drown out the silence. But as the story unfolded, I found myself leaning forward, pulled into the lives of the characters. It was about a couple who adopted 3 children, and their journey to become a family. It wasn't perfect. There were fights, misunderstandings, and moments where it seemed like everything would fall apart. But through it all, they fought to make it work, to create something beautiful out of chaos. By the time the credits rolled, I was holding the remote tightly, my thoughts spinning. I thought about Emma, how she'd knelt in front of me, begging for another chance. I thought about the baby, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine as if to say he trusted me, even though he didn't know who I was. We'd fought for so much before. We'd gotten through the early years of scraping by, the heartbreak of trying and failing to start a family. Maybe we could get through this too. Maybe she really had been a victim of circumstances, manipulated into something she couldn't control. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one I could live with. I left the motel that night and drove home. When Emma opened the door, she looked at me like she was afraid I'd changed my mind. I told her we would be fine, that we'd keep this between us, tell everyone the pregnancy was ours, and move forward like we always had. For a while it worked. We told her parents first, then mine, and their joy was infectious. They cooed over the baby, praised Emma for how naturally motherhood came to her, and patted me on the back like I was a hero. I smiled, nodded, and pushed the doubts to the back of my mind. Our son, because that's how I thought of him now, grew quickly. He began smiling, babbling, and clutching at my finger with a grip stronger than I thought possible. Some days, when I held him, the ache in my chest softened. He didn't feel like the professor's child. He felt like ours. But peace never lasts. It came on a Sunday afternoon, just as Emma was putting the baby down for his nap. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone absent-mindedly, when a new message popped up from an unknown number. The words were like a slap to the face. How do you live with the realization that the child you love was impregnated by another man? My heart stopped. The phone shook in my hand as anger surged through me. I didn't need to guess who had sent it. Only one person could know the truth. The professor. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the screen. My mind raced. After everything I'd been through, hadn't he done enough? Hadn't he taken enough from me? I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the fury bubbling up, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to crumble, to lose control. Instead, I typed back a message. Just 5 words. Tuesday, 8 p.m. Marina Café. I hit send and set the phone down, my heart pounding. The professor had crossed a line. And now it was time for me to finish this. When I sent the message, I wasn't planning a fight. There was no need for that. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of my rage. I wanted something simpler, to put an end to this once and for all. I arrived at the Marina Café early that Tuesday evening, the summer heat still hanging in the air. The place was quiet, with a few people scattered at the outdoor tables, sipping coffee and staring at the ocean. I found a corner table and waited, my hands resting lightly on the phone in front of me. Minutes turned into an hour and he didn't show. At first, I felt a wave of anger. But then, I realized it didn't matter. He had nothing left. I picked up my phone and sent him one last message. Don't ever contact me or my family again. Stay out of my life, or I'll make sure you regret it. I didn't wait for a reply. Over the next few weeks, I began hearing more about him, through acquaintances, whispers in academic circles, and the same forums I had once flooded with accusations. The professor was no longer the man he used to be. His career had unraveled completely, and he was now single, unemployed, and drowning in debt. I had made sure he couldn't find a stable position anywhere. No university wanted to risk the rumors surrounding his name. His once pristine reputation was in tatters, and he had no one to blame but himself. But even knowing all that, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in seeing him fall apart. The damage was done, and my focus was no longer on him. It was on us. Emma and I started seeing a psychologist not long after I returned home. At first, it felt strange, sitting in a room with someone else while we peeled back the layers of everything we'd been through. But the sessions helped. They gave us a space to confront the anger, the heartbreak, and the fear that had festered between us for months. For the first time, I began to see Emma as more than just the woman who betrayed me. I saw her guilt, her vulnerability, her desperate need to make things right. And I saw my own faults too, how I had clung to the idea of perfection, how I had ignored the cracks in our foundation for years. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt impossible. But we were working on it. One night, not long ago, Emma reached out for me in a way she hadn't in months. The baby was asleep, the house was quiet, and we were lying in bed, just talking. Her hand brushed mine, tentative but warm, and when I looked at her, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: hope. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't rushed either. We made love that night for the first time since everything had fallen apart. It wasn't the same as before. It was something entirely new. For the first time in what felt like forever, we weren't clinging to the past or worrying about the future. We were just there, together, rebuilding. My life isn't perfect. It never will be. But as I watch my son grow, yes, my son, because that's what he is to me, I feel something close to peace. Emma and I are far from where we started, but we're learning to trust each other again, one small step at a time. The shadows of the past are still there, lingering in the corners of my mind, but they don't define us anymore. The storm has passed, and we're still standing.